if you guys need to go to the other break rooms as we progress through this, just feel free to come and go, whatever you got to do. I'm talking about insurance, so pretty dry topic. We did it a year ago. We didn't get through all the slides, so that's why Ray asked me to come back. So the question will be, as I go through this, if we're hitting subjects or issues that you want to fast forward, give me that look. I'll be able to read your face based on how many Z's you're racking up. But I think the most important thing you want to take away from today is the insurance industry is very much like the world that you interact with. It's all reactionary. We're always behind trying to play catch up. So as a result, anything I'm going to tell you really is based on information that my world has gathered over the past probably 5 to 8 years, but we're never looking forward. Insurance is probably one of the most archaic institutions out there, so understand what you're dealing with, and it's a necessary evil, unfortunately. You could start with even property type claims. People didn't build structures to withstand Category 5 hurricanes until one came ashore and blew a bunch of buildings over. Now suddenly we have building codes. Well, you don't want to be that first case study where everyone goes back in time and uses your name, your company, as the case study. So just know that the insurance industry is not your solution to all your problems. It's a necessary evil, and it's our job to try and help you navigate within it. So that's going to be a big focus of what we're going to talk about today. So the first part is just sort of trying to establish what your contractual liability is throughout this maze or network that you're trying to navigate. If you're on the consulting side, you're going to be signing contracts with your vendors and or your client base. Typically those contracts, and we'll get to that at the end, how they're structured, where the liability flows. That's really important to try and control the ultimate liability that's going to find its way to attach to you. So you have legal liability based on the advice that you're selling and offering to your customers. And it may not just be the typical liability issues that you think of. It could be something where, I've got a slide that will address it here in a minute, we could have situations where there's been no breach or theft of data, but yet there still is a security breach. So that's a big part of this, is having a secure environment, but it's not just the virtual environment, it's the physical environment as well. To dissect the liability that you've got, you're gonna have two kinds of liability. And this is the part where, if I haven't lost you already and you're getting sleepy, it's dry. You're gonna have the direct liability, but you're also gonna have indirect liability. The direct liability makes perfect sense to everyone. And the example at the bottom of the page will help you conceptualize that. If you break somebody's window, they're gonna force you to repay and replace it. That's your direct liability. The indirect liability is where you are a piece of the process. You're one link in that chain. So your advice, either directly or indirectly, has brought harm to someone else. As a result, you're going to get pulled in. That's the beauty of living and working in America. Our legal bar is so aggressive and so well oiled that they're going to come after you, and they're going to assess that liability. And if they find that you have resources, if you have some type of deep pocket, they're going to empty out that pocket. So the insurance that you're looking at for protection and coverage is going to be based upon how much liability limit you can purchase, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about later today, is how much insurance do I need? If I buy too much, have I just put a bullseye on my back because I do have that deep pocket? Or if I buy too little, is it a way to make the bad guys go away because I'll just declare bankruptcy and walk? That's probably a topic for another time with your own attorney. But those are two schools of thought. So when I meet with larger companies and we're trying to figure out how much cyber liability insurance do I need, that's one of the first things we fight about all day long. Do I need 300 to 500 million of limits, or should I just buy 5 million? And when the lawyers show up, I'll hand them the deck page of my policy and say, there's $5 million. I'm an LLC. I'm going to declare bankruptcy. You fight it out with AIG. Figure it out. I don't have an answer to that question other than just buyer beware. Know that if you're going to take that approach, you better have a really good legal team behind you. So cut me off as I'm going if you have questions, et cetera. Yeah?
Yeah, my question is, the professional liability and the cyber liability, how do those
Good question. I've actually got a slide on that, so we'll get to it. But the short answer is professional liability versus cyber liability. How do the two relate? They are interrelated. One of the things I'm going to recommend as we get to the end is the program design. If you're going to build a policy to protect you, one of the things I'm going to encourage that you do is don't just buy a cyber liability policy, buy one that includes your professional liability. We like to call it miscellaneous professional liability. So if you have a contract with a client that says, hey, you got to carry insurance, what I want to do is make sure that we wrap your policy around the service offerings, the description of services that you disclose in the contract, because that becomes the roadmap for the plaintiff's bar to sue you later. You said you would do these things in writing, and in exchange, you collected a fee. That exchange of services for a fee therein links you to the liability. So what we would do is we'll build a policy that wraps around all of that, whether there's a breach or not. So what we're going to do is we're going to layer in different insuring agreements, and it's not that expensive. You just need to know how to do it. And what I tell people is, if you're buying an insurance policy off the shelf, it's probably a 5-minute transaction. They pull it back, they sell it to you, you write a check, and you're done. Take 15 minutes, do it right, and you're probably going to sleep better at night. But think of it like your car. You can drive down the road and you've got anti-lock brakes and an airbag. It doesn't really mean anything until you hit a wall. You may never have a head-on collision, but the day you do, you're going to be glad you've got it. So yeah, you definitely want to have a policy that wraps around all your professional liability. So really good question. This slide really speaks more to just the whole objection of, do I even need the insurance? I think that's an easy answer. Yes, you need it. The question is how much and how do you want to structure it? So for those people that feel that maybe I don't need the insurance, what you need to be thinking though is if you choose not to build out a policy with adequate limits to protect you, then the question is, what will you do if someone shows up at your door and serves you with a lawsuit? If you're fine paying out of pocket, then yes, you don't need the insurance. But remember that it's sort of a limitless pit that you're about to jump into. There is no bottom to it. It's really whatever the court system decides and assesses the liability at the end of the day. So at least if you're in partnership with an insurance company, they take on that fight, they mount the defense, they stand in your shoes to protect you. And one of the things that I'll talk about today is we don't really, my firm doesn't really push insurance, even though I'm an insurance broker. We look at things more from a holistic perspective, which is why Ray brought me in with Pierre's seal of approval, which isn't easy to get. And the reason I say that is most insurance brokers, and you need to realize this, they're compensated based on commission. No, I don't care whether you're buying life insurance, property insurance, cyber insurance. The premium dollars are this, and the carriers pay you a percentage of that premium as commission that goes into my pocket. So the more cars I sell in a day, the more money I'm going to make. So what you need to be careful about when you're working with, and I'm not trying to throw a stone at all the insurance brokers out there, but just understand how they're compensated. The faster they get you out the door and they get your premium check, the quicker they move on to the next transaction. And this is an important theme because a lot of what's being discussed over the next couple of days is the exact same thing when it comes to security in your world. In other words, the quicker we can slap a Band-Aid on it and move on, the better. It's no different in my insurance realm that I operate in. So the way I got connected into this group was my team in Chicago has spent a lot of time and effort trying to help people understand that I can sell you hundreds of millions of dollars of cyber liability insurance, but if you don't have the right controls and procedures, my insurance is not going to be enough to keep you in business. So you want to take that philosophy into everything you look at this week when you're here at the conference, because what I always tell folks in my world is follow the money. The first thing you need to figure out is what's motivating your insurance broker and your insurance underwriter to even want to be your partner. Well, at the end of the day, it's probably money. So you've got to figure out how are you going to manipulate that process so you get the best outcome. And I know that sounds a little bit strange, but you need to understand that's how my world operates. So I've had companies come to me that will, after the Target breach up in Minneapolis, that'll say, hey, our board of directors got together, we want $500 million of insurance and we need it before the next meeting, and that's coming in 2 weeks. Well, I can run into London and find a couple $100 million to limit for these companies. But if they haven't put in the right encryption software, which is now considered an assumed level of protection, back then it was considered cutting edge. Now it's not. It's assumed that you have encryption protection for all your data. So if that's true, and I'm going to buy you that insurance, what good is that insurance if you don't have state-of-the-art protection controls and procedures? So let's assume the premium that I might show up for that $300 million of limit is $4 to $5 million annually. And that's a check that you're going to write every year between now and eternity, because that's a 12-month policy that keeps renewing. So as your broker, I get commission on that premium every single year. So the question you need to be asking is, why would I pay $3 to $5 million of premium over a 10-year period if I could invest that in my IT infrastructure and have cutting-edge, state-of-the-art protection controls and procedures versus having this static policy over here that doesn't really do anything? So yes, you need the insurance, but it's not. It shouldn't be the first reaction or the first step. It's probably the third or fourth action that you should be taking. But you need to start with the architecture first and foremost. Once you figure out what that structure is going to be, you can blend in the insurance to be a part of that, but it's not the solution. It's one part of the solution, but it's certainly not the whole solution. So I mentioned this earlier. You can easily have problems within your environment that have nothing to do with a privacy breach. It's just a breakdown of your physical security procedures and controls. And a lot of times people forget about that. So I bring that up just because it's so obvious. And we have insurance that covers a lot of that as well. There's pretty much insurance for anything you can think of. And what I try and tell all of our large clients, whether it's the Caterpillars of the world down to McDonald's Corporation, you've got to decide based on your own balance sheet how much you're willing to retain in-house, how much you're willing to invest to make sure that the claim never happens, and then how much you want behind all of that, which is where the insurance steps in. So again, in that example that I just gave you, we're third in line. We're not first or second in line. So keep thinking of insurance as, again, something that's going to come more at the tail end rather than the beginning. As fast as we can come up with solutions, the plaintiff's bar is always going to be 10 steps ahead of us. So the best thing you can do is, rather than trying to fight it, just accept it for what it is. We saw, I'm trying to think what it was. We were working with a large company in the Midwest, and what had happened was they had sold themselves as cutting edge. You hire us, we'll be your outsourced turnkey when it comes to managing all of your facilities. And part of that involved dealing with their human resources, their benefits programs. And one of the things that got them in trouble was they sold the fact that biometric screening is one way to track your employees as they come and go. Well, the danger with that is, and I attribute this back to the plaintiff's bar, they started passing laws in probably 2005 all the way up to 2008. And the laws were passed by the plaintiff's bar in each state such that that's now become, your biometric data is now protected data. And you can't collect that without properly disclosing, and it depends on the state, but in this example, it was an annual disclosure. You need to tell those employees at least once a year in writing, I'm going to collect your thumbprints or your retinal scan or whatever it might be. And so you have the issue of storing the data, because if someone steals your identity, you can't get a new thumbprint. It's not like your credit card number or your social security number, right? So what the plaintiff's bar, I think, did was they knew that this technology was coming. We weren't there yet. So 10 years ago, rewind the tape, they started passing these laws saying that we've got this information out there, how are we going to store it and how are we going to protect it? And then you also have the issue of notification, where you have to tell these people, these employees, that you're going to be storing that data. Well, fast forward to 2018, we have an entity that got involved in this. They were helping think of them as sort of an outsourced turnkey approach for managing your employees, they are now in a really tough spot where they've been marketing and selling their services, mostly I think using the thumbprint for logging these hourly employees in and out. Now they have the plaintiff's bar, they've found this company and they're now targeting them as a potential defendant, and it's probably going to be a lot of different lawsuits, and it's going to be very, very expensive. But that's a great example where I don't think anyone was trying to game the system from the defendant's perspective. I do believe the plaintiff's bar knew exactly what they were doing. They buried this in the ground, knowing one day that this seed was going to germinate and a tree was going to grow. That's the new money tree for our plaintiff's bar. But that's just one example. I would never have been smart enough to pass a law in the state of Minnesota that said you can't do these things. It would never even occur to me that we would want to collect somebody's thumbprint, that you could somehow steal that imprint and then use that to steal someone's identity. Now when we talk about it today, it makes perfect sense. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have connected the dots. So use that as just an example to think through how creative the plaintiff's bar is. Contract review is a big issue for most of you if you're on the consulting side. The problem is a lot of your customers are going to be, for the most part, larger entities, so they're going to dictate the terms and conditions of those contracts that you sign, so be very careful. And the problem is, how do you take on Goliath when you're the small David throwing 1 or 2 stones at him? The concern's got to be, how much of that liability are you willing to absorb and consume? Because there has to be some limit. You've got to draw the line somewhere. They can't Caterpillar can't push all the liability back on you. It's just not fair. So when you're going through it, do it with your eyes open. The second bullet here about insurance requirements, those are negotiable. And I would tell you, probably half the time, if not more, we're able to negotiate some of those requirements down. So Caterpillar may tell you to go buy $10 million of cyber liability and professional liability insurance. If you push back, you can probably get them to agree to $3 million or $5 million. And that'll keep the contract cost down for you because you're passing that back, obviously. Now remember, your insurance broker, because he gets paid on a commission, isn't going to suggest this, because if you buy $10 million of insurance limits, that's a much bigger premium and a much bigger commission for that insurance agent. I'd have your own attorneys review these things before you sign them. If not, set up a relationship with someone that you're going to be using on an ongoing basis. Most of this stuff is boilerplate wording that you're going to be asked to execute. So I would definitely have some type of partnership with a law firm. And it's not as expensive as you think it is. I would definitely draw them in early, because once you've signed the contract, it's too late. You're not going to be able to change it. The signed releases I'm a big fan of. If nothing else, it sort of begins where the project gets going, and it also draws that end point. It draws a line in the sand, sort of where your liability begins and where it ends. So at least if something goes wrong, you have an idea of how bad it could be and how much it's going to cost you. This is one that people forget to ask. You should cap your limits based on the value of your contract. Why should Caterpillar be allowed to hit you for a $5 million liability when the value of the contract, your engagement's only $300,000? I mean, again, I think that's a fair pushback, and your attorney that you bring in will be able to help you as well. A good insurance agent and broker should be willing to do this for you. Most of them, again, will lay silent on it, but that's another place you can ask for it, and you're not paying them by the hour. But usually we like to cap it at some multiple of the contract value. In this case, I've seen, at least the clients I've worked with, 2 to 3 times is where we've been successful in capping your limit. I've got a couple slides that follow here that'll just talk about how you're going to add value to your customers and your clients. So if you're providing some type of IT consultancy work, you're making them a better risk. We need to find a way to help you take advantage, take credit for that, because that client of yours probably is buying cyber liability insurance as well. So if you're helping improve their IT infrastructure, let's create 3 or 4 sentences that's going to summarize that so we can attach it to the application when your client is trying to secure their own cyber insurance. You just helped save them some money. And this just speaks to that same point. Any questions so far?
Actually, I've got a question for the room, for the consultants. How many of you have cyber insurance? And how hard was it to get? Because I've got it as well. I've got $5 million, and it was like pulling teeth. And you're talking numbers like $100 million insurance policy, and it's kind of blowing my brain a little bit here, because to get $5 million was a mandate of one of our accounts.
Sure.
As a utility, and we're like $5 million in cyber liability. What is that? So 2 years ago, we went through the process to get it, and it was rather painful. We had a whole bunch of forms to fill out. We had to update our entire internal policies around how we store our own data in order to even get underwritten. So I'm wondering if anyone else had that kind of issue.
Yeah, we had on one of our contracts, they asked for, we had a $50,000 contract, and their expectation was $100 million in cyber liability insurance as part of their border plate. So we ended up negotiated out and negotiated completely out of it based on where we factored what information we were willing to hold and what information they were expecting. But it was, and we based upon the points here of all our communication with them was using their VPN, and everything that we maintained of their information was in an encrypted framework. So that's the way we limited it, and then got them to release it from the contract, because we told them, if we can get this, we're just going to take whatever that number is and mark it up 10%, and that's what you're going to pay for the premium. And oh, by the way, since it's going to be multi-years, we're going to put that in with an escalating value for the next so many years. And they saw how much the $50,000 contract was going to go over $100,000 for them, and wrote it off.
So to answer your questions, and I agree, negotiating out of that limit is important. The other piece of that is you need also to evaluate your contract, the value of your contract against the liability that you're putting in. And clarifying the risks to the client is very important. Working with your legal team and your broker or your insurance is very important. Now, going back to your question on how easy it is to get an insurance, I can tell you from my experience 3 years ago, getting a cyber insurance was 4 questions. Do you have an antivirus? Do you lock your computer? Basic questions. Today, you get questionnaire which is 5 to 10 pages long that you need to go through with some of the insurances. Now, the question back is on the insurance policies. There are a couple of terms that are very important for the insurance policies to cover, including the full prior acts, for example, and the worldwide coverage. So can you shed some light on these topics in terms of the coverage for cybersecurity liability?
Yeah, I'll address that. You had a question as well on the same.
I'm not a consultant, but your E&O, that is, so they're tacking on with yet another cost?
Yep.
Absolutely.
Great contract. There are no integrators, it's all consultants, but I think consultants might be interested in what the integrators do. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So we have approximately, we have 300 integrators, of which 200 are security integrators, the other are prorated. Of those, approximately 70% have cybersecurity insurance. A specific policy for cybersecurity, not bound up in there. We've been preaching and begging, probably because we loan them money and we don't want them to rip the kid, but they can't pay us. So it's a little bit selfishly, oriented. But nevertheless, we've had pretty good penetration. We have had approximately $4 million of cybersecurity claims with our integrators. There are these are estimates, close but estimates. 20 claims, $4 million. So this equates to $200K a pop. The largest one was $358,000, which was paid. So that's the activity with the SIs, and at least in our group. I think pretty soon we'll have 100% of our guys insured. And we get 0 from this, by the way, so this is not a sales pitch either. But most of them are going
No, all good points. To answer your question about prior acts, this is a claims-made policy, so you definitely want your past prior acts covered. It really is imperative that you sit down with your insurance broker to understand how that works. We think in layman's terms of, well, if I buy the policy today and something happened 3 months ago prior, do I have coverage for it? There's your prior acts. So think of claims made as a linear one-way street timeline. So if you buy the coverage today, it usually is in increments of 12 months. You're only looking at wrongful acts, breaches, for example, that happened going forward from today, the effective date of the policy, for another 12 months. Well, what if you had a breach that took place 3 months ago or 3 years ago? Or worse yet, what if you had a breach that took place 6 weeks ago and it's still ongoing? Now it jumps over the wall. Those are all things that you need to build into your policy with your insurance broker. A good one should be able to give you full prior acts. And I would tell you that whatever the cost savings involved with a prior acts exclusion, don't ever accept one for that very reason. Most breaches don't take place in a static environment. It goes on for a long period of time. It also takes us longer to discover it and then to actually figure out what was taken as far as the information and then assess a dollar amount to it. So all those things are interrelated. You definitely want worldwide coverage, as you mentioned. Some policies, this would be another session for several hours where if you're not asleep yet, I can knock you out quick. Every cyber policy is different, so they don't layer up perfectly. So normally when you buy a property policy, those are probably 98% similar. In my world, the cyber policies might be 60% similar. So that other 40% differential is like the Wild West. It's all over. How they define PII, how they affect things such as when does the meter begin with the insurance company's dime versus yours. And the reason that's important is you may have a suspected breach, but we haven't figured out that it's a breach. Do we have coverage yet or don't we? That's a good example where if you had a big deductible, let's say your deductible was $100,000 to $500,000. When do we start eroding the deductible based on those expenses where we're investigating the claim? So, and the quicker we get into the deductible, the quicker we get to the carrier's policy limit. So you can see all the games that go on behind the curtain. Unfortunately, there is no short answer to that. It's you're going to rely heavily on knowing what you buy out of the gate and working with your broker, and that's one more reason why you want to have a good attorney. What I do, my team actually has its own, we have our own attorneys on staff as well as an outside law firm that I pay for. So if you engage my firm, we bring our coverage lawyers at the front end as well as at the back end. But you definitely need them at claim time. It's not a simple, my building burned down, the value of this building is $5 million, give me a check for $5 million. The claims are all a disaster. I've never had a claim that's been easy. And I've never had anyone come up to me afterwards and say, this is great, let's do it again. So it's just different levels of pain. So you just need to know that you're walking into this foggy swamp, and it's the more people you can have behind you that will navigate you through the mess, the better the process will be. But it's not that simple. We call it first party, like a property loss, where you have an appraised value, you know what that building costs to rebuild, and then you're done. It's nothing like that. And you can imagine the different shades of gray that we're going to peel back. How do we define what a claim is? How do we define what a loss is? How do we define, like I said earlier, what a PII is? Again, everybody's going to have a different definition based on the carrier you work with. You made a really good comment about how easy or how difficult it was to obtain the insurance. It really depends on the carrier you're working with and the broker that's representing you in the marketplace. How you package your exposure on the front end has everything to do with what comes out the back end, as well as the process. So if we have incomplete information, yeah, you're going to go through the proctology exam, and they're going to be, probing you left and right. We have some carriers that only rate based on revenues and number of records. But again, I tell people, you have to decide how that relationship, if you want to have one with your carrier, is going to be built. Some people don't want to have that relationship. Others want to spend time. We encourage most of our difficult risks to have conference calls or meetings with our underwriters. The reason is if there's ever a disagreement and there's a claim, I can back off as the broker and say, guys, we were in the room, we all took notes, this is what we agreed on. it makes that go much easier so that when we're trying to negotiate a settlement, nobody's fighting over the money. It may just be, instead of us being this far apart, we're only this far apart. So that's a big part of what my team does, is we try and get all the interested parties in the room so we know what the risk is going in for the insurance company, and then you know what you're paying for as the buyer. But most of our claims are really, really difficult. So back to sort of adding value for your clients, you can take the same theme of you definitely want to help them review their cyber coverage, and that's an area that no one's really diving into. You have a vested interest in making sure that that's done properly. Obviously, when you go through that exercise, that's where you could bring in your attorney or your insurance broker, whoever it might be. It's the way I tell people is it's all advice. You get what you pay for. So if you're offering a free, unvarnished opinion, then it's just one more piece of information they can hang their hat on, but it's certainly not the end point. But I think the more of that information you can gather for your client, the better they'll sleep at night knowing that they've got the right coverage and protection. So this is the slide you were probably wanting to dive into as far as how do I build my coverage. And I didn't get into all the definitions and things because, again, it would take us really deep into the weeds. But the policies are built really from two pieces. If you look at the blue boxes at the top, you've got your first party coverage, which will pay for what I'd call some of the mundane exposures that you might have in the event of a claim. And then you have your third party liability. That's where the lawyers get involved. And we can layer in as much or as little of these different insuring agreements as you may or may not want. So it's important to see this not so much just for you, but also for your client base. So a good example would be your multimedia exposure. So that would cover things like personal injury, defamation. If you have a client that's involved with, let's say, the publishing industry, or let's say the music industry, anything where you might have some intellectual property, as well as, I'm trying to think, we're working with a large company right now that's partnering with Disney through one of their animated movies that's getting ready to come out. You click on the picture of the car and it takes you to their website, and now you can buy used cars. That's a good example where Disney is trying to impose liability on my client through a contract. We are going to obtain multimedia liability, even though it would be a far fetch for us to have a claim. It still is an exposure where we could get brought in. Technology E&O is probably a good module you'd want to consider adding in. Technology E&O covers everything beyond what I call privacy. So if you're doing software development, if you're doing any type of hardware, IT infrastructure, anything that goes beyond what I would call the normal privacy of records and data, technology errors and omissions would be sort of the broad insuring agreement or net that you would cast to try and capture all these exposures. So we can layer this in. It does add cost, but it's something you want to consider. Regulatory is another area that I like to put up here because a lot of policies exclude it. Back to my earlier comment about no two policies are alike. Well, that's one of the biggest areas of exposure that you might have, especially for one of your clients. So if a regulator comes after them or a governmental authority, some of these policies actually have regulatory exclusions in them. You got to read the fine print. Or worse yet, they'll put a sublimit in for regulatory claims. So I'll pick on, we do a lot of business for the banking industry. If you're a bank and you have a reg exclusion or a reg sublimit, you're not really getting any cyber coverage. That is who's going to come after us. If we screw up as a bank and there's a breach regarding all of our bank records, we're going to have all kinds of regulators lined up outside our door. So again, this is where you got to look really carefully at your terms and conditions. And I've got a slide that we'll look at next that talks us through it. But anytime there's a sublimit, that's the insurance underwriters talking back to you saying, we think you have exposure, so we're going to give you this small sliver of limit, and that's how we're going to try and escape the liability. And the reason the insurance industry does that now is their exclusions don't always hold up in court. So if I can give you a $100,000 sublimit, that's actually as good, if not better, than exclusion. So one sidebar would be, we see a lot of wage and hour sublimits for employment-related litigation. And what that means is if an employer has a lot of hourly workers, like this hotel, and we make those workers clock in 10 minutes early, or rather show up 10 minutes early, but they're not swiping their key card, and then they leave 10 minutes later after their shift. That's 20 minutes a day we're not paying them, even though they're on site here at the Renaissance Hotel. That's a wage and hour claim. You do that times several thousand employees, times 352 days out of the year on an HR practice that's been out there for 10 years, that's a wage and hour claim. So what the insurance community has done when they provide these employment practices policies is rather than trying to put on a wage and hour exclusion, they give you a wage and hour defense sublimit of 100,000. So you can do the math. They'd much rather just give you 100 grand on that $100 million loss because they've only got to cover this much of it and then they're done. And they don't have to worry about fighting the fitness of that exclusion if they were to try and insert one in. So anytime you see sublimits, it's a red flag. That's what I tell everyone. So back to your earlier question about how do I build the policy, I would look at some type of master policy structure that's going to pick up all these different pieces. And again, you're not paying a lot of money for it because typically your underwriters are going to rate it based on your number of records and the amount of revenue that you generate. So you start there, and then you can think of it like a ripple in a pond you're going to push out. So you can make this as broad or as narrow as you want based on the exposures you're seeking to cover. And that's what I tell everybody. I can sell you the perfect policy. The question is, do you really need it? And that's where you've got to bring all that into balance.
Do you find that MEPs can actually ask their clients to work with them and find and actually disclose their own insurance contents?
Yeah, the question was, do we find that MEPs? Oh, he's got.
Do you find that we have leverage to actually get that information as part of our contractual negotiation?
That's better.
Do clients disclose?
It depends on the client. I mean, that's a wishy-washy answer. I think the bigger the client, the harder it is to get out of them. But if they're truly partnering with you, then I think you can get that information as long as you sign an NDA. That's what if you get the pushback, I would just tell them, look, I've already signed a non-disclosure agreement. This question is part of that as well. So what they're afraid they're going to share something with you that gets out and then they get sued later.
Right. Well, would we, I mean, do we need, sorry, from our perspective, do we actually need that in order to go to our broker and say, this is, where the borderline between our liability and their liability is that a requirement?
No, I mean, what I do is I use your contract as sort of the border. That's what creates the borders for me. The contract value, in Bert's example, it's only $50,000. We know what the scope of the contract is. Here's what we've said we'll do in writing. That's how we do it. And then I basically put a fence around that contract, and that becomes my policy. And if typically you're buying a policy for all of your exposures, not that one contract. So what we always tell people is tell me about your 3 to 5 largest customer engagements. Let me see those contracts. They're probably written very similar. Then I can build the policy around it. And it brings up a good point. Some people do like to buy what we call contract-specific policies. In other words, just a policy for this one engagement. We do that for very, very large IT projects. We normally don't do it for anyone else because it's not a wise way to spend your premium dollar. The reason is, if you're the insurance underwriter, the insurance company, I got to put up $5 million of my limit, whether you buy it for one contract or 100 contracts, right? So there's a fixed cost, there's a minimum premium for that capital that the underwriter puts out there at risk. So if the minimum premium is going to be $8,000 for a $5 million limit, some crazy number. If he's going to charge you $8,000 anyway for that $5 million limit, well, what would the cost be for all your contracts? Maybe it's only $12,000. So it's usually not a huge delta. It's usually not a big jump or step up. So I always tell people we can sell contract-specific coverage. Again, I really don't push it because I don't think it's an efficient way to spend your premium. Some insurance brokers like it. The more policies they issue, again, the more premium they can peddle, the more commission they're going to earn. So we've already talked about this slide a little bit, just making sure that your client contract matches up with the insurance that you put into place. And just know that those policy limits typically will be no less than those minimum requirements within the client's contract. This slide always generates a lot of interest. How does the underwriter come up with my price? What's my premium and why? Right now, it's the Wild West. There's probably about 50 to 60 different carriers we interact with in my world. They all have their hot buttons or areas of focus. Not all of it's logical. Some of it is something as mundane as they're only looking at your industry class and they ignore everything else, or they're only looking at your revenues. The danger there is we have, in my opinion, insurance underwriters that really aren't well trained to understand your business. So don't enter into the discussion thinking that they understand and know what you do. We have to tell them over and over again. The better they understand what it is that you're doing, the better chance we have to build a policy that will trigger. But these are most of the factors that our underwriters are going to look at. Loss history on the far, sort of on the far right there, to the edge of the page. That's a big one. Believe it or not, we have some people that have had frequency of claims, which it sounds strange, but we have had that. And what I always tell people is most of the claim activity we bump into is it's like flying planes at O'Hare. Every day is a near miss. It's just pure dumb luck that you don't have a fireball and a terrible collision. So I always warn people that just because you see notices on a loss report where it'll show CCNP, claim closed, no payment. Well, everyone thinks, well, that's great. We didn't have to pay out, so I guess it wasn't a big deal. That's not always true. Sometimes it's just dumb luck. So I think there are a lot of companies out there that still have not come to grips with their own exposures and how to control them. And as a result, they're just kind of blindly going through the day, and it's only through the grace of God that they haven't had that terrible midair collision. So loss history is one that I look for, and I look for the frequency as much as the severity. And we see it in all different types of policies, not just the cyber. It could be employment related. You could have the same event that happens in Tennessee involving, let's say, 10 female employees at this hotel, and they close that out with only paying $1,500. Take that same event, throw it into California, that might be a $500,000 to a $1.5 million claim. Venue and dumb luck. So we can't control all the different factors that are involved when a claim's about to go down, but they have a huge contributing element to what the final outcome is going to be. This is an area that people always forget, breaking out the types of records from within the number of records. So you have the whole population of data. If you have a lot of PII, help your client break down the data within his application. Don't just say I have $10 million or 10 million records on file. That's going to scare the heck out of any underwriter. What you need to show them then is of that 10 million, there's only 500,000 of those records that are really sensitive. And these are the types of data points hiding within those 500,000 records. So in other words, you've taken what was once a huge number that would scare the heck out of most underwriters, and they would probe and pry and maybe even just decline it outright. Now we've made it a very manageable, digestible risk. So this is probably the area where I see the biggest disconnect with our underwriters is they come to a quick conclusion and move on. Because you got to remember, they might have a stack of submission files this high on their desk, and they've got to get through them in one day. So you want to make it easy for them to get through that data. We just talked about the records. This just gives you a little bit more detail. This is an interesting footnote, though. Only in the last 90 days, and it's happening over in London, because there's so many carriers and it's becoming so competitive for cyber liability, our underwriters in London, of all places, have hired independent firms to provide a third-party assessment and review of the exposures that they view from their underwriting, from their perspective of your client. And that they hand that over at when they're quoting, whether you buy their insurance or not. Now they'll hand you this 20-page report that says, look at all these pretty pictures, you should be impressed with us, and by the way, we want to sell you some insurance. But it's a whole new twist to the sales process that I keep telling people is that's great, and you should look at the data, but at the same time, you should be asking yourself, why are they doing this? And I'll tell you why. It's really, really competitive in my world. There's 50 to 60 carriers out there all day long that are quoting stuff I hate to say it, but they're not much better than the guy quoting automobile insurance. So as a result, they're trying to differentiate themselves from all those other insurance companies that are also quoting those cyber policies. This is one way to do it. And what they're doing is they're going through the submission, the application, and then whatever they can find in the public domain on your client, on your customer. They're going to their website, trying to surf it as best they can. And in some cases, these are white hat hackers trying to break in, and they'll tell you what they found when they got there. That could be received both favorably or unfavorably. Not everybody likes having people snooping around their house when they're gone. So as a result, to me, that's a really dicey game to be playing. So what we've done with our customers, if we've told them if we're going to go to these carriers, this is how they underwrite. You need to understand this is part of their process. But again, I feel that we're crossing a line that may be hard to get back to when it comes to trust and working with your partners. But just know that this is a rising area which we'd never seen it before. And the first couple of ones I got were unsolicited. I didn't even know our underwriters were doing this. So they were hiring outside firms to basically hack in to the submission files, the clients I brought to them, which is, it's a little disturbing, but at the same time, I understand what they're trying to do. So we talked a little bit about key coverage enhancements in these policies. What I think is more important today, rather than the coverage itself, because a lot of this stuff is basic, it's the definitions and the exclusions behind the coverage. So I can get you third-party dependent business interruption, which sounds great. How broad is it? What's the wait period? If your policy comes with a 72-hour wait period for third-party dependent business interruption, what good is it when the power grid goes down? Sorry, I know we were relying on Commonwealth Edison to provide the electricity, but now that they're gone, I got to wait 72 hours before I can get into the policy limits. I'm out of business by then. So you need to really look at how the policy structures the coverage and go through in a very simplistic discussion. Well, all right, again, follow the money. How do I get it? How do I get you to pay out on my claim? If I got to wait several days, and there's also co-insurance, and there's a large fat deductible on top of that, those all layer together before I get into the insurance company's pocket. So just be really careful.
So I'm going to ask a question at this point, because I want to. There's a couple things I want. You're probably going to talk about a little later, but one of the things is that when we talk about, say, a physical security assessment, right, that's now more converged than before, because we have to look at the cyber controls as well as the physical controls. And as we're doing these assessments, we are reaching into the operational environment as well. We have to come up, because we're being hired by maybe a CIO, or we're hired by a combined group with audit and compliance. We may have cyber and we have security. So they're all asking us, to give our opinion in regards to our assessment, that they can start making decisions, to proactively define their environment, and technologically as well as the threats and vulnerabilities. So here's the issue, right? So now that we're talking about both sides, right, or three sides of the fence, that insurance policy becomes important, because they're going to start saying, look, this insurance policy also guides us in regards to cybersecurity, because that's going to happen, right, within that policy. So how do we know that we're protected in regards to evaluating that cyber liability insurance, as well as, all these different factors are being put, onto that policy, right? And then how are we defining if we're actually covered if there's an event? I think the problem is that because there's so many different ways they're giving us a policy, based on PII, based if it's a utility, it's NERC SIP, there's all kinds of regulatory concepts. Who's going to review that? And that's really important, because we're not knowledgeable enough.
Good question. I'll give you the easy answer, since I'm standing up here with the mic. You want a trusted broker that you can rely on, that will walk through your policy, which is what Pierre is teeing me up for, so thank you. What I do with all my clients is sit them down, and we try and whiteboard for them what are the three most catastrophic events, leave insurance out of it, that can harm your business. And it might involve a breach, it might not. Just what are the three most significant events that can take you down? then I'll figure out if there's an insurance policy that I can somehow participate in that or wrap it around that. So it goes back to my earlier statement, follow the money. If your number one concern is that you're Ford Motor Company and you can't keep spitting out Ford F-150 trucks at the end of the assembly line, because that's where they make most of their margin. We don't care if we can't make Ford Festivas anymore. Those subcompacts, we don't make any money on those. Every time we sell a pickup truck, we make a lot of money. So we want to make sure that if an assembly line goes down, it's not going to be this one. When they can give me that type of guidance, then I can go back into their insurance policies, cyber included, to make sure that everything that participates in making sure that that pickup truck comes out at the end of the day, that's what I'm looking to build, and that's how we structure the coverage. Most people, again, are looking to slap a policy off the shelf in your lap and then give you a bill. That's, for the most part, what's going on. So a good example is contracts. We exclude liquidated damages in almost all the policies that I broker. But I will also tell you that every broker that sells you a policy fails to tell you that. Wonder why? So what we do is we go back and negotiate with our underwriters through our definition of loss to include liquidated damages. But it costs more money, and there's a lot of underwriting that goes into it. So that's a great example of just one little event that we're going to try and dive deep into. But it only happens if we can engage the ultimate buyer of the insurance. We need the insured in the room telling us what those top 3 doomsday scenarios are, then we'll try and work with them. So again, cyber's part of it, but it might be something as mundane as we need to know that we have enough power coming in from the grid so that we can keep our assembly line on. Or maybe it's we go out and we buy diesel generators, and then we go through that scenario with their team. All right, that's great that you bought generators. Where's the diesel fuel? Well, it's over here in storage tanks. How do you pump that out of the ground? Well, we have electric pumps that pump it out of the ground. That goes in. Well, that doesn't do you any good when we don't have any electricity. So you can see how circular it is. So when we sit down with our clients, we're trying to drill as deep as we can into those, again, that short list of doomsday scenarios, the catastrophic events that are going to kill and bring down that company, or at least cripple their balance sheet. When we can do that, then we have a chance to build insurance that's actually going to work. But if you don't do that, you're really just kind of rolling the dice with your eyes closed as you drive down the road. You're hoping not to hit the wall. Does that answer your question?
One other thing, I mean, it's also important because one of the things that I've faced, and obviously doing cybersecurity assessments, is that the key question is you cannot leverage cybersecurity cyber liability insurance to fully protect yourself if you're not doing all the right things.
Correct.
Right? So client, I'm dealing with a client who says, well, I've got cyber liability insurance that's going to protect me in case I'm not, I have a breach. And I says, well, have you done assessments? Have you done network architecture assessments and device discovery? Do you know what your data looks like? And I think that the part is that all physical security consultants today are faced with cyber liability, even though they don't know it. And so because they're being leveraged within that environment, when they do an assessment that touches cyber, okay, they are part of the chain of custody in regards to the liability. And as we're evaluating these issues consistently, we are going to be brought into cases consistently especially as we go into smart buildings and smart cities and all the connected technologies. So I just want to prepare everybody to really understand what's coming because the rubber's meeting the road very quickly. You guys that I know that I work with, all who touch this, I mean, I could name the ones that are here, those are the ones who get it, unfortunately. The ones who don't get it are all sitting in the other rooms right now, which is okay. We just need to get them more educated about this. So that's what I'm trying to really, what is that trigger, I think, is where I'm worried about. Where is that trigger that says, okay, I've got to make sure my client realizes that his cyber liability may not cover specific events, right? And then when he does an event, what ends up happening? He's not covered. And all of a sudden, he's got a loss for millions of dollars. That's where we're all trying to figure that out, I think.
Yeah, and I still think the real focal point is not buy the insurance and then the insurance steps in and makes your day brighter and better. It's the reverse. don't have a loss. Do everything in your power to prevent it, document the heck out of it, so that you're doing what a prudent man would do and more, so that when you do get called in, if there's a claim, you have some type of defensible position.
So just to add on the topic, I think you need to also work closely, as all of us as consultants, with our legal teams to limit our liabilities and define where's this red line in terms of liability with our clients, whether we're doing physical security or cybersecurity assessments. So it's very important to have the multiple layers. Again, as you mentioned, cyber liability insurance is not your first line of defense. That's your third or fourth line of defense. Your contracts is your first line of defense initially, and then you go on from there.
I mean, think about reputational insurance. The brand name of a large company, and Target's obviously one of the most common ones. Once the public loses confidence in that name, in that brand, there's no amount of insurance I can sell you that makes you whole, that brings Target back to where it was. So if we can agree on that scenario, I can bake in what we call reputational insurance into a cyber policy, believe it or not. So what? So I pay you $10 million because nobody wants to shop at Target anymore. That's a rounding error for them. They need billions of dollars of coverage. It doesn't exist. I can't get it for you. So that's back to what Pierre was saying. That's what people need to understand, is when your brand, when that company has been tarnished to the point where the buying public just doesn't go there anymore, they choose with their feet, they go buy somewhere else. There is insurance, and this is where people don't think of it properly. Insurance is not a remedy for that situation. The only thing that's going to happen is that Target's going to lose a lot of revenue for a long time until people wake up. And there's no amount of discounts, free giveaways, or anything else that they can sponsor that's going to bring those customers back. People only come back when their memories fade, or they're willing to give them a second chance. But in our world, you know, even though breaches are becoming more common, even to the consumer, there's no guarantee that the consumer will return. And I think where people have lost some of their focus is, look at the amount of online sales that go on right now. It's not even the transactional sales face-to-face that go on anymore. It's the stuff that's going on offline, where we're seeing all the revenue growth. If for some reason some of those big monsters had a problem and the public lost confidence in them, are we going to keep buying our paper towels through Amazon? Don't know. But the point is, there's a huge emotional element to the insurance that I'm talking about today when you have a claim, and that's not insurable. That's what people don't realize. So again, when you're on a whiteboard, that's one of the things we talk about is brand or reputational damage, because that is not insurable, and that's where the CFO needs to try and put a number next to that. When he or she sees that number, that's the wake-up call for most of these people, because I tell them, even if I had insurance for you, there's not enough limit on the planet that I can sell you that's going to replace that, because it's not uncommon for one guy to go down and then see others in the chain also to be affected. So those are the things you want to be helping your clients focus on from your role as their IT consultant. The more you can open their eyes beyond just this view to this view is what's missing in this whole conversation, is we need to be looking at it, the entire enterprise. The insurance is one aspect of it, but it's not the solution. It's just one contributing factor to help get you back on your feet. And I use the analogy of, well, look at Ford. If they had that plant burn that was spitting out the Ford F-150 trucks, we have fire insurance that will replace that. We have business interruption insurance that will probably replace that as well. But how long does it take to replace that plant? What do we do with all those workers that have been displaced and they've moved away now? So maybe the plant gets rebuilt in 6 months. I've lost all my tool and die workers that used to be there. They've gone on. Unemployment in the United States is so low, you know, it's the lowest it's ever been. I can't hire enough people to turn my plant back on, even though I've rebuilt it. So you can see all the steps when you're talking about it in a whiteboard environment. There's no insurance that I can come up with that's going to pay to bring back those skilled workers. So those are the types of things that we need to have on the wall for our CFOs to listen to.
Thanks. So earlier, there was a comment made about a global coverage, a global umbrella. And it got me thinking about those of us that have accounts that are global. If a scenario comes along, whether it's directly or indirectly, where we're in a GDPR violation, have you seen any coverage to support that? So if a large company says they're in violation of GDPR, and subsequently, we might be partially, even if it's indirect, have you underwritten any kind of policy that supports against that?
For the indirect exposure, I've done it for the direct. I haven't crossed the bridge yet on the indirect side. We do have GDPR coverage that we're building into all of our renewals right now. We started maybe a year ago when all that went into effect in May, if I remember. So I would argue the indirect liability should be covered under your policy if you're a contributing factor to that. What's missing in the GDPR endorsements that I've seen out on the street, and they're all different, just like the policies, they don't line up. You got to remember, over in Europe, they define PII a lot more broadly than we do, especially with the biometric data. So that's a good example of, you got to make sure the definitions are broad enough so that we can capture the exposure. I'd say there's probably only about 4 or 5 good carriers out there that have developed endorsements that pick up the GDPR. The rest are sort of blindly trying to follow the rest. So not encouraging, but that's our world.
My question is a lot more ground level, mundane, but for me to try and understand, how this fits into insurance. If our clients do have biometric data, of course, right, because they use scanners and stuff. So, have you seen the the line between who guards that database skewed towards consultants ever, or is that always just an in-house problem for the actual client themselves?
To your benefit, the legal world looks at it as whoever is storing it is responsible for it. You would have some liability if you had provided advice on how to store it, on how to protect it. I think that's what you're really getting at. So you would have that vicarious indirect liability where they would come after you. So even if we could get you dismissed, think of it like from an insurance perspective, you want enough to cover your own legal fees so that you can hopefully get excused, but it might take you a couple of days of depositions to get beyond that with your team of lawyers sitting with you.
Have you seen, like, in your
In your experience then, like, have you seen, you would know, the claims environment, but so does it often, do you often find that the reverse finger pointing, from the client side and from then again
Absolutely, every
from
time,
the consultant
yeah.
side? Is that normal then?
That's the American way.
So one of the things that's important is also, as a consultant, if you recommend, say, a storage solution in regards to infrastructure compute, okay, that is, say, we are in an EMC Dell environment, we recommended that. We also recommend biometric in regards to, say, multi-factor authentication to entry. And they are storing that database on the HR side or the Active Directory side. And you recommended, in effect, 2 or 3 of the 5 solutions that are part of the final solution. I can almost guarantee that you will be part of the lawsuit.
Yeah, put it this way. If you're the plaintiff's attorney, there's no harm in not bringing you in. I mean, why not? My thinking is, my job is to maximize the recovery for my clients, so why would I want to dismiss you? If there's any chance of modest recovery from you, I'm not letting you out. So that's, if nothing else, you want the insurance there at a minimum to pay for your own legal defense. And remember, it's one aggregate limit. Once you spend the aggregate limit, it's gone. So if you buy $1 million limit from AIG that covers all those things in that slide with the pretty puzzle pictures that I had, or pieces rather, that $1 million can be spent defending you. It can be spent if there were a breach, let's say, of your own records and your own client's info. to restore their data forensics, et cetera. But once you spend that $1 million, they're out. You may still be in the middle of the lawsuit, but AIG is now done. They've done their part. So I always tell people that buy at least enough insurance to hire your own defense, and then hopefully a little bit left over for a settlement. So I always tell people, think of it in those terms and start with what's the value of my business itself, how much do I really want to protect, and then how much am I willing to spend in the way of premium. When you bring all those three together, it'll be a pretty easy decision.
One other thing, in Europe, right as we speak, there are companies that are that have VMS systems that were aggregating facial recognition information on individuals in regards to using it for marketing purposes within retail environments that are now being sued under GDPR. Now, here's the interesting part. Whoever presented that consultant or that end user with that solution without really explaining to them that they would be in the target range of a GDPR violation, which is 4% of their gross sales, is in deep hot water. So that actually is part of what California and New York have already passed. So be cautious. If you do any business in California or New York, because it's going to cross over the entire United States in a short amount of time. So, you know, be cautious in regards to when you're doing an assessment and you're giving them recommendations. It doesn't matter if it's, you know, a nonpartisan recommendation. It's a recommendation, and you do a design that's part of it. Make sure you have hold harmless. You put yourself in a defensible position.
That's actually a really good point. So you could have something as harmless as a recommendation today, similar to my discussion about just the biometric laws that are starting to show up in the different states, not realizing that it's going to have these implications down the road. Therein lies the exposure that you personally and your business, your consulting business, may possess. So it's real easy to point fingers and have that second guessing 10 years down the road. And when you're in the middle of that mess, it's going to be very expensive to get out of it. So it's actually good advice.
So wouldn't that be mitigated by having legal terms that basically the recommendations are valid within a certain period of time?
Yes.
And that will cover the insurance as well.
Yes, but at the same time, I would caution you, it's only as good as the venue where you're trying to defend yourself. So when you wrap that cloak around you with that disclaimer wording, it may hold up in Tennessee, it may not hold up in California. And again, you're dealing with 50 different jurisdictions, and we're still in a very decentralized infancy stage here in the U.S. There's not a lot of federal regulation and guidance. So think of it like the cannabis laws and how those are starting to change. Colorado, Washington, some of the different states, California now, Canada just legalized it. So what may protect you in Alberta may not protect you in Quebec. So just know that you're tiptoeing around a minefield. So I guess we're down to 1 minute. So any other questions? All right. Thanks for staying awake. You can find me afterwards if you need anything else.